Welcome, quietly, to this corner of the night, where the voice stays low and the stories stay soft. Tonight we drift through a long, unhurried collection of mysteries that have never quite found their answers, stories that ask only that you rest and listen. So lie back, let your shoulders settle, and allow the voice to carry you gently wherever these still and wandering roads may lead. Far away from wherever the last story left you, far out across the warm and shimmering blue of the Atlantic, a new place comes into view. It is December of 1945, and the war has just ended, and the world is exhaling slowly after years of held breath. At Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, 5 Avenger torpedo bombers sit quietly on a sun-warmed tarmac, their engines cooling in the afternoon light. The aircraft are sturdy and reliable, designed to cross long stretches of ocean without complaint, and today they are being readied for a routine training exercise. The mission is called Navigation Exercise 19, a simple triangle of flight over the Bahamas and back, the kind of route these men had flown many times before. Lieutenant Charles Taylor, an experienced pilot, climbs into the lead aircraft and settles himself at the controls, watching the horizon ahead. The 5 planes lift off one by one into a bright blue Florida afternoon, their engines steady, their wings catching the warm coastal air. Below them the ocean is clear and shallow, the Bahamas banks glowing pale green and turquoise through the afternoon light. For the first hour everything proceeds as expected, the aircraft follow their course, the sea passes gently beneath them, and the radio stays quiet. Then, in the mid-afternoon, a voice comes over the radio, Taylor's voice, sounding measured but uncertain, asking his fellow pilots which direction west might be. He tells them that his compass is behaving strangely, both compasses, in fact, and that he is not entirely sure where the flight is positioned. The other pilots listen, and together they try to work out their position from the color of the water and the feel of the sun in the sky. Back at Fort Lauderdale, radio operators begin to notice the transmissions and grow still, listening carefully to the fragments coming through. Taylor tells base that he believes the flight has passed over the Florida Keys by mistake and is now flying northeast, back toward the Atlantic. Those on the ground believe he is actually over the Bahamas, heading further out to sea, and gently, they try to redirect him west. But the radio contact is intermittent, fading in and out with the strange interference that sometimes settles over that stretch of ocean. Somewhere out in that blue expanse the 5 planes continue flying, trusting their instruments, trusting their pilot, searching for a coastline that does not come. As the afternoon softens toward evening, the fuel in the planes quietly diminishes, and the light on the water begins to change from gold to gray. Taylor's last recorded transmissions speak of flying into the wind, of trying to stay together, of watching the sea below grow darker and harder to read. At around 7:15 in the evening, the signals stop, not with any urgency, not with any final message, simply quietly gone. A large rescue aircraft, a Mariner flying boat, takes off within the hour and heads out over the dark water toward the last known position. That aircraft also vanishes, and though a ship in the area reports seeing a brief flash on the water, no trace of it is ever found. The search that follows is one of the largest in naval history. Ships and aircraft comb thousands of square miles of the Atlantic and the Gulf. They find nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no rafts, no debris of any kind that could be tied to Flight 19 or to the rescue plane. The sea offers back nothing but its own calm surface, indifferent and wide, as if the planes had simply passed through and continued somewhere else entirely. Investigators work through the records carefully, the flight plans, the weather charts, the radio logs, looking for the moment things turned. They conclude that Taylor became disoriented and led the flight northeast over the open Atlantic rather than west toward the Florida coast. But disorientation alone does not account for everything, for the compass anomalies, for the silence that fell so completely, for the utter absence of any wreckage. That region of ocean, between Florida, Bermuda, and the Bahamas, had already gathered a quiet reputation for ships and planes that went out and did not return. Whether that reputation is coincidence or something stranger, no one has ever been able to say with certainty, and the ocean keeps its silence on the matter. And so Flight 19 remains out there somewhere beneath the great blue quiet, 14 men and 6 aircraft, unhurried now, and finally still. Somewhere quieter now, there is only the soft sound of turning pages, old vellum whispering against itself in a still room. In the early part of the 20th century, a book surfaced in northern Italy that no one in the world could read. It came from the Villa Mondragone, an old estate outside Rome, carried quietly into the hands of a book dealer named Wilfred Voynich. Voynich opened the book and found page after page of writing in an alphabet no living scholar had ever seen before. The letters curve and loop in a way that feels almost familiar, almost like something you once knew, but cannot quite place. The manuscript is thought to be very old, its vellum dated by careful scientific study to the early 1500s, perhaps even earlier. No one knows who wrote it, or in what country, or for what purpose it was ever meant to be read. Scattered through its pages are drawings of plants, but the plants do not match any species that botanists have ever catalogued on Earth. Their roots curl in ways roots do not curl, their flowers bloom in arrangements nature has not thought to make. There are pages of tiny naked figures bathing in pools connected by tubes and channels, flowing from one vessel into the next. The pools and their figures feel almost medical, almost ceremonial, as though describing some process the body undertakes that no modern word names. Other pages hold diagrams of stars and suns arranged in circular charts, spiraling gently outward toward the page's edge. Astronomers have looked at these charts and found patterns that almost correspond to known constellations, but not quite. It is as though the manuscript describes a sky that sits just beside our own, slightly tilted, slightly turned. Cryptographers have spent careers attempting to find the logic beneath the script, and each time the pattern slips quietly away. The text has a rhythm, a frequency that behaves like natural language, with common short words and rarer longer ones. And yet every attempt to find a corresponding language, a cipher key, a root tongue, has ended in quiet silence. The book rests now in the Beinecke Rare Book Library at Yale, held in a climate-controlled room with careful, measured air. Scholars travel from many countries to sit with it, to hold its pages in cotton-gloved hands, to listen for something the text might say. The vellum itself is animal skin, stretched and dried centuries ago, still smooth, still holding its ink without cracking. Some of its pages have been removed at some point in the past, leaving only stubs where a story might have continued. What those missing pages held, whether more plants, more stars, more figures in their quiet pools, no one can say. There is a section some call the pharmaceutical, where small vessels and roots are arranged in careful rows across pale pages. The vessels look like containers for something, gathered and stored with intention, though the intention remains entirely unspoken. Slowly, over the decades, the manuscript has accumulated theories the way old things accumulate dust, gently, without effort. It has been called a hoax, a herbal, a medical text, an alchemical record, a private language invented by a single careful mind. None of these explanations has ever settled into certainty, each one leaving a small remainder that the theory cannot account for. The illustrations are the part that stays with most readers long after they have closed the book and turned away. There is something gentle in them, something unhurried, as though the artist worked in a quiet room with time to spare. The plants breathe on their pages in their own way, neither threatening nor welcoming, simply present, simply drawn. In time, researchers began to scan the entire manuscript and release those images openly, so that anyone anywhere might look. And so the book that was kept in a locked cabinet for centuries now rests quietly on the screens of people falling asleep in cities across the world. The pages drift by slowly in the scrolling light, still unread, still carrying whatever they have always carried in their quiet loops and curving lines. And the book waits, as it has always waited, unhurried and patient, for the word that will finally let it speak. High in the Himalayas, the wind moves slowly across the snow, carrying nothing but cold and the quiet of great altitude. Far above the tree-line, where the air thins and the world grows still, there is a small lake cradled in a ring of rock and ice. The lake is called Roopkund, and it sits at nearly 5,000 meters, hidden from the lower valleys by walls of ancient glacier-carved stone. For most of the year it lies frozen and silent, and no one passes through this high corridor of rock. Only in the brief warmth of late summer does the ice begin to loosen at the edges, pulling back from the shore. And it was in one such summer long ago that a forest ranger, walking the high trail, looked down into the shallows and saw something that should not have been there. Beneath the surface of the water, just below the skin of meltwater, lay hundreds of human skeletons. They rested on the lakebed and along the rocky shore, still and undisturbed, as if they had simply lain down and the mountain had kept them there. Some still wore remnants of clothing, preserved by the cold and the altitude, threads of fabric pressed flat against old bone. Wooden artifacts lay among them too, rings and bangles carved from material no longer found nearby, resting quietly in the shallow water. The lake is very small, perhaps 40 meters across, and yet it had held this secret for a very long time beneath its winter ice. Studies carried out over many decades placed the bones at roughly 1,000 years old, though not all at once. What the analysis revealed, quietly and without easy explanation, was that the people had come from at least 2 different places and perhaps 2 different times. Some were likely from South Asia, their bones carrying the quiet record of a life lived far below, in warmer, lower lands. Others, surprisingly, seemed to have come from somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, 1,000 years ago or more. What would bring people from such distant places together, high on a frozen Himalayan trail, is a question the mountain has not answered. There is an old local pilgrimage route that passes near Roopkund, still walked by devotees who climb in large groups every 12 years. The route leads to a glacier shrine, and pilgrims have walked it for centuries, ascending through thinning air and deepening cold. Perhaps those who now rest in the lake were pilgrims too, caught by something the mountain sent down without warning. The skulls, many of them, show a similar injury, a deep blow to the back of the head, round and clean. Not the wound of a blade or an arrow, but something blunt and round, falling from above, striking the crown and the back of the head. In the high Himalayas, hailstorms can arrive in minutes, dropping stones of ice the size of cricket balls from a sky that was clear only moments before. Above the tree-line, there is no shelter, no overhang wide enough, no forest canopy, only open rock and wind. A sudden storm on a narrow trail, with nowhere to descend and nowhere to hide, could take a great many lives very quickly. And yet, even this explanation, gentle as it is, cannot account for the people from distant shores, nor for all the bones, nor for all the centuries. The lake fills and freezes again each winter, and each summer it releases a little more of what it has been holding. New finds surface each season as the ice retreats a little further than the year before, slow and patient in the warming air. Researchers continue to study what has been collected, and each result seems to open a new question where one had seemed settled. The mountain holds its quiet, and Roopkund remains at 5,000 meters, patient and cold and largely untouched. The wind moves across the water in the evenings, folding tiny ripples that reach the shore and stop, one after another. Whatever brought so many people to this single place, through so many different centuries, remains as still as the water itself. There are no answers carved into the stones here, only the stones themselves, and the cold, and the long silence of the mountain. And the lake rests as it always has, high above everything, keeping its own kind of time, unhurried and unasked. Somewhere far below, the world moves on in its ordinary way, and up here the wind settles, and the water grows still once more. From the cold stone of ancient places, thought drifts now toward paper, thin, yellowed paper, and ink pressed carefully into rows of strange symbols. Somewhere in Northern California, in the long quiet summers of the late 1960s, letters began arriving at newspaper offices. The letters were written by hand, calm and deliberate, each character placed with a kind of patient, unhurried care. Inside each envelope was a coded message, symbols that looked like nothing any ordinary reader had ever seen before. The symbols mixed together letters and crosses, slashes and circles, arranged in neat columns across the page. The sender called himself the Zodiac, a name he placed at the end of each letter like a quiet signature. The crossed circle he used as his mark looked something like an old navigational symbol, simple and ancient feeling. 3 of the cipher letters arrived at 3 different newspapers on the same morning, each carrying a portion of the full coded message. Each newspaper received a different section, as though the sender had deliberately split the puzzle across many hands. When the 3 sections were laid side by side, they formed one long cipher of 408 characters in total. Cryptographers and curious readers across the country bent over copies of the cipher, slowly tracing each symbol with a finger. For a week the cipher sat unsolved, a quiet arrangement of shapes that seemed to resist every ordinary approach. Then a schoolteacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty sat together at their kitchen table and began to work through it carefully. Betty noticed that the cipher seemed to begin with the letters E, G, and I, a pattern she recognized from older coded messages. Working slowly through the night, they matched symbols to letters, one small substitution at a time. After many quiet hours, words began to appear inside the cipher like shapes slowly becoming visible through lifting fog. The message that emerged was strange and calm, written as though the sender were simply reflecting on something private and inward. The decoded text spoke of hunting, and of a belief that those he killed would serve him in an afterlife he imagined for himself. It was a quiet and unsettling message, not shouted but placed on the page in the same patient, careful hand. The 3 remaining cipher letters sent by the Zodiac were never solved for many decades, resting quietly in archives and case files. One short cipher of only 13 characters was sent later, and it has remained unbroken even now, long after everything else. Researchers across many years tried different approaches, different alphabets, different frequencies, and still the symbols held their quiet shape. There is something restful, in a strange way, about a puzzle that resists all effort. It simply remains, patient and still. The original cipher letters were preserved and are held in archives, where they sit in clean folders under controlled light. People still look at photographs of the cipher pages and trace the symbols the same way the Hardins traced them in 1969. In the long unbroken cipher, some symbols appear again and again, like a word the sender kept returning to without quite finishing. Some of the symbols were invented by the sender. They do not belong to any known alphabet or coding system. That invention is part of what makes the remaining ciphers so difficult. The key, if there is one, may exist only in memory now. A team of codebreakers finally solved the Z340 cipher in December of 2020, using computer pattern analysis over many long months. When the solution appeared, the decoded text was again quiet and private, a continuation of the same strange interior voice. It mentioned the gas chamber, and it mentioned hiding his identity, and then it wandered into sentences that still feel incomplete. The Zodiac was never identified with certainty, and so the letters rest now without a name fully attached to them. The cipher pages are a kind of monument now, not to any solution, but to the quiet persistence of an unanswered question. And somewhere in the still air of an archive, the 13 unsolved characters wait, unhurried, in the same patient silence as always. Somewhere along the quiet coast of the Pacific Northwest, there is a body of water called the Salish Sea. It is a gentle inland sea, sheltered by islands and mountains, where the water moves slowly and the air carries the faint smell of cedar and salt. The sea is wide and still for much of the year, its surface catching the pale gray light of long overcast afternoons. Along its shores there are small beaches of smooth stones and driftwood, where the tide comes and goes without urgency. It was on one of these quiet beaches, in the late summer of 2007, that something was found that no one could easily explain. A human foot, still wearing a running shoe, had washed ashore on Jedediah Island in British Columbia. It was a right foot, size 12, in a blue and white trainer, and it was found by a young girl walking along the waterline. No other remains were nearby, and the sea gave no explanation for how the foot had come to rest there. In the months and years that followed, more feet began appearing along the same coastline, each one still inside its shoe. They came from different directions, carried by different currents, arriving weeks or months apart on different shores. The Salish Sea is a place where ocean currents move in slow, circling patterns, gathering and releasing what the water carries. Oceanographers who study the sea have long noted that objects lost offshore tend to stay within the basin, circling slowly for years. Modern athletic shoes, it turns out, float remarkably well, their foam soles buoyant enough to carry a foot across miles of open water. When a body enters cold seawater, the natural processes of decomposition in salt water over months can separate the foot at the ankle joint. The shoe then becomes a small vessel of its own, carrying its contents slowly wherever the current decides to take it. What no one could answer so easily was whose feet these were, and how they had come to be in the sea at all. Some of the feet were eventually matched to people reported missing, individuals who had disappeared near the water over many years. Others have never been identified, and the sea has not offered any clearer account of where these individuals began their final journeys. The Salish Sea spans an enormous area, from the Strait of Georgia in the north to Puget Sound in the south, connected by narrow channels and quiet passages. Along its edges, small ferry routes cross the water between islands, their wakes dissolving slowly in the still gray mornings. Herons stand motionless at the water's edge, and sometimes a seal surfaces briefly before slipping back beneath the green water. It is easy, in a place this quiet, to understand how something could drift for a long time without anyone noticing. Forensic investigators examined the feet carefully, and in several cases determined that the individuals had likely entered the water voluntarily, overwhelmed by circumstances the sea knew nothing about. For others, the origin remained genuinely uncertain, the water having taken any final evidence long before the shoe reached shore. There is something quietly remarkable about the way the sea preserved these remnants, holding them in its slow circulation for months before releasing them. The shoes themselves became a kind of record, their brand names and manufacture dates helping to narrow the years in which they might have entered the water. Each arrival on shore brought a quiet wave of attention, then a long stillness as investigators waited to see if the sea would offer any more. By 2019, more than a dozen feet had been found along the Salish Sea coast, a number that seemed both too many and somehow too few to constitute a pattern anyone could fully understand. Scientists and journalists tried many times to explain the phenomenon completely, and each time the sea absorbed their certainty and remained as it was. The water here is very cold and very deep in certain channels, and things that sink in it do not always return in a form that answers questions. What the sea does return, it returns slowly and on its own schedule, guided only by tide and wind and the quiet turning of its currents. And so the coast of the Salish Sea continues as it always has, green and quiet and patient, its water moving in long slow loops between the islands. The beaches are mostly empty now, the stones worn smooth by water that has been moving since long before anyone was there to notice. And somewhere beneath the pale surface, the currents continue their slow, unhurried work, carrying whatever the sea has been given to keep. From the quiet stone and soil of ancient places, the air itself carries us gently now, drifting towards something closer, something found on ordinary ground. Along the Atlantic coast of Florida, where pine forests meet sandy soil, a family named Betz walked their land one calm afternoon in 1974. A small fire had recently moved through part of their property, leaving the earth swept clean and open under a pale sky. Walking through that still and emptied ground, they noticed something half resting in the soil, catching the flat afternoon light. It was a sphere, perfectly round, about the size of a bowling ball, and its surface was smooth and silver and entirely unmarked. They lifted it, and the weight of it surprised them, heavier than it looked, solid all the way through, or so it seemed. They brought it home and set it in their living room, where it sat quietly for several days, simply a strange and beautiful object. Then, one morning, someone in the house plucked a guitar string nearby, and the sphere began, very softly, to hum. It was not a loud sound, just a low, sustained tone that seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside the metal, then slowly fade. The family noticed too that when they moved the sphere to different rooms, it seemed to find its way back to where it had been. Whether this was memory playing tricks in a tired household, or something else, no one could quite say with certainty. Word spread slowly, the way things did in those years, and eventually the sphere attracted the attention of journalists and then scientists. Metallurgists examined it carefully and found its outer shell was made of a stainless steel alloy of unusual purity and uniformity. Inside, beneath that outer shell, instruments suggested there was another layer, a separate inner sphere, floating freely within the first. What filled the space between those two shells, if anything at all, remained unclear and somewhat unsettling to those who tried to measure it. The Navy took an interest, and so did aerospace engineers, and the sphere passed through several sets of careful, unhurried hands. None of them, working separately or together, could say with confidence where the object had come from or how it had been made. Some suggested it might be a ball bearing from some industrial machine, lost or abandoned and slowly buried over years. But the precision of its inner construction, that floating inner shell, did not match anything known to be produced at the time. Others wondered quietly whether it had fallen from something passing above, a satellite fragment, a probe, something not yet accounted for. The sphere sat through those conversations unmoved, still warm from the afternoon sun when they brought it back inside. In time, a German magazine published the story, and physicists from across Europe wrote letters requesting to examine it. One group of researchers measured a slight but consistent magnetic field emanating from within the sphere, pulsing at slow, even intervals. What generated that field, if anything inside was moving or active, remained something no instrument could resolve into a clear answer. The Betz family kept the sphere for years, growing quietly accustomed to its presence the way one does with something that simply stays. They described it as a good companion of sorts, something that asked nothing, made no demands, and simply rested in the light. The humming, they said, would come and go on its own, unconnected to any sounds they could identify in the house around it. Scientists who visited noticed that the sphere seemed slightly warmer to the touch than the room temperature would naturally explain. Whether that warmth was a trick of perception or something more persistent, the instruments gave only gentle and inconclusive readings. Decades passed, and the sphere eventually passed out of the public record, quietly, the way so many strange things do in time. What became of it after those last recorded examinations is not clearly documented anywhere that researchers have since been able to find. Somewhere, perhaps, it still rests on a shelf or in a drawer, smooth and silver and patient, not asking to be understood. The pine forest where it was found has grown back slowly over those years, soft and green and unhurried as always. And the ground there holds its quiet the way ground always does, keeping whatever else may still be resting just beneath the surface. Imagine rising slowly above the earth, above all the noise and motion, drifting until the world below becomes nothing but blue. And somewhere in that blue, between Florida and the island arcs of the Caribbean, there is a region where the sea holds its breath. The waters here are warm and clear, lit from above by a generous subtropical sun that reaches all the way to the sandy seafloor in the shallows. From the surface it looks like any other stretch of ocean, gentle swells, a few clouds trailing slowly westward, the occasional glint of light on the water. But below, resting quietly on the seafloor, there are things that do not belong there, hulls of ships, wings of aircraft, all come to rest in this one triangle of sea. This is the place known as the Bermuda Triangle, and its wreckage field has been accumulating, quietly and without explanation, for well over a century. The triangle itself is not officially mapped, it has no lines drawn on any nautical chart, no marker buoy, no government designation. It is simply a region, roughly between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, where stories began to accumulate the way sediment accumulates on a riverbed. The wreckage field beneath those waters is real, confirmed by divers, by sonar maps, by the slow patient work of those who have spent years looking. There are ships there that left port on ordinary mornings, with ordinary cargo, with crews who had made the crossing many times before. And then at some point the radio went quiet, the log entries stopped, and the sea closed over them as though they had never passed through. One of the earliest and most quietly haunting disappearances involved Flight 19, 5 Navy torpedo bombers that lifted off from Fort Lauderdale on a December afternoon in 1945. The weather was fine, the pilots experienced, the route a routine training triangle, out over the ocean, north, then back to base. Somewhere over the ocean, the flight leader's compass began behaving strangely. He reported that both compasses were off, that nothing looked right below him. His voice on the radio was calm at first, methodical, the voice of someone working through a problem they expected to solve. But the transmissions grew shorter, the intervals longer, and then there was only static, a long, soft hiss that the base operators kept listening to long after hope was reasonable. No wreckage from those 5 planes was ever found, not a seat cushion, not a panel, not a single piece of the machines or the men inside them. In the warm waters of the triangle, wood rots slowly, metal rusts to nothing, and the seafloor sediment covers whatever sinks within a season or two. The sea, in this part of the world, is a very efficient keeper of secrets. Perhaps even stranger than the lost planes is the long record of ships found drifting, intact, undamaged, with food still warm on the galley stove and no one aboard. The Mary Celeste is the most famous of these, found adrift in the Atlantic in 1872 with her sails set and her cargo untouched and every soul gone. Investigators found the captain's logbook open on the table, the last entry perfectly routine, written the day before the ship was found empty. Whatever happened did so between one ordinary entry and the next, in the space of a day or less, in waters that gave nothing back. Researchers have spent years mapping the wreckage that does rest on the bottom here, and what they find is not random, not evenly spread. There are concentrations, patches of the seafloor where debris from different eras lies close together, as though something in the water drew vessels toward the same coordinates. Some of these concentrations lie near the edges of the Bahama Banks, where the shallow platform drops away suddenly into water more than 4 kilometers deep. The transition from turquoise shallows to that deep blue is visible from the air, a line drawn across the ocean by depth itself. Below that line, in the deep blue, the wreckage lies in permanent stillness, no current strong enough to move it, no light reaching it from above. Scientists who have sent submersibles into those depths describe a profound quiet. Instruments measure pressure and temperature, but the cameras show almost nothing moving. It is a place where time seems to have stopped, where a brass fitting from a 19th-century schooner can lie beside the aluminum skin of something far more recent. No one theory has ever explained all of it: the methane hydrate hypothesis, the rogue wave models, the magnetic anomaly studies each account for some cases and leave others untouched. And so the wreckage field remains what it has always been, evidence of something, shaped like a question, lying very still in the dark below the warm Caribbean blue. The surface above it moves as it always has, swells rising and falling, the wind making small patterns, the sun tracking slowly across the sky. And far below, in the stillness where no wave reaches, the triangle holds what it has gathered, quietly, patiently, without explanation. The air grows warmer here, slowly, the way a breath held too long finally releases into something soft and still. Somewhere in the western Atlantic, in the early months of 1918, a great gray ship moved quietly through warm Caribbean waters. The USS Cyclops was enormous by the standards of her time, a collier carrying coal and manganese ore across warm open seas. She had made this crossing many times before, her hull familiar with the rhythm of Atlantic swells and the warmth of southern latitudes. In early March she departed Barbados, her holds full, her crew of nearly 300 souls settling in for the journey north. The sea that day was calm, the kind of calm that feels almost like permission to move slowly and without worry. She was bound for Baltimore, a familiar port, a straightforward passage that her captain and crew had completed before. And then, somewhere between the warmth of Barbados and the gray northern coast, she simply stopped arriving. No distress call was ever received, no debris field found drifting, no oil slick marking where something had ended. The ocean offered nothing back, not a life ring, not a piece of hull plating, not a single page from the ship's log. Search vessels moved slowly across the likely routes, their crews scanning an ocean that looked exactly as it always had. The Cyclops had been one of the largest vessels in the United States Navy, over 500 feet of steel and riveted iron. A ship that size does not simply vanish without some trace, and yet the sea kept its silence completely. Her cargo had been manganese ore, heavy and dense, filling the great holds deep below the waterline. Some have wondered quietly whether that weight shifted in ways the ship could not recover from, somewhere in a night crossing. The theory settles gently over the mind like a slow tide, possible, soft, and still entirely unproven. Others have turned their thoughts to the sky above that passage, wondering what weather moved through in those unrecorded days. The Atlantic in March can carry squalls that rise without much warning, the water turning from blue to a deep churning gray. But even storms leave things behind, broken spars, torn life preservers, a scatter of flotsam on some distant shore. The Cyclops left nothing at all, and that silence is what has kept her memory quietly alive for more than a century. Her name still appears in naval records, listed among those lost without explanation, without coordinates, without a final known position. The men aboard had lives that continued right up until the moment they did not, ordinary routines, meals, the watch change at dawn. Somewhere a cook was preparing breakfast, somewhere a sailor was writing a letter he would never send. These small human moments drift through the imagination slowly, the way all things drift in the long slow pull of deep water. The region she passed through has carried many names over the years, but none of those names explain anything about what happened. What remains is only the shape of the absence, a route she was known to take, and an ocean that did not return her. Slowly the light shifts on the water, the way it always does in late afternoon, moving from gold to something quieter. The sea holds its own kind of memory, not in words or records, but in the slow continuous movement of its currents. Those currents would have moved through the same waters she crossed, indifferent and continuous, carrying nothing and everything. In time the official investigations quieted, the reports were filed, and the space where certainty should have been was left empty. The Navy marked her lost in action, though no action was ever identified, no enemy, no collision, no final signal. She rests somewhere, that much seems certain, resting in the way that only very deep things rest, still and unhurried and beyond light. The ocean above her surface tonight is calm, the swells moving slowly, the stars reflecting in long soft ribbons across the water. And somewhere beneath all of that quiet, the Cyclops continues her stillness, undisturbed, unhurried, waiting in the deep warm dark of the sea. Somewhere in the west of Scotland, the only sound is the slow wind moving through old beech trees above a narrow stone bridge. The bridge is small and gray, built from local sandstone in the late 1800s, arching gently over a quiet wooded gorge. Below, a stream called Overtoun Burn trickles between mossy boulders, its sound barely reaching up to the parapet above. The estate around it is still and green, its old manor house sitting quietly behind iron gates and long grass. For most visitors, this place feels simply peaceful, a corner of the Scottish countryside left gently undisturbed by time. And yet, for decades, dogs walking across this bridge have done something that nobody has ever been able to fully explain. They leap from the parapet, not startled, not chasing anything visible, but deliberately, almost calmly, over the edge. The first recorded accounts came from local people in the 1950s, who noticed it happening again and again at the same spot. Always the same bridge, always the same side, the right-hand parapet, facing northeast toward the open glen below. The glen is soft and forested, full of ferns and bracken, the stream winding quietly far below the bridge's edge. Local people began to call it the Dog Suicide Bridge, a name that felt both strange and somehow right for what kept happening. Some dogs survived the fall onto the rocks and bracken below, and some, after being helped to safety, came back and leapt again. That detail, a dog returning to leap a second time, is the one that sits quietest and longest in the mind. Those who have watched it describe the dogs as moving with a kind of steady purpose, not fear, not excitement. Something draws them to that particular stretch of parapet, and whatever it is, it has been drawing them for 70 years. Researchers and naturalists have walked the bridge slowly, pausing at the spot, trying to sense what a dog might sense there. One possibility offered quietly over the years is scent, the smell of mink or other animals nesting in the gorge below. The bridge's solid parapet walls are high enough that a dog, nose lifted to the air, cannot see the drop on the other side. So perhaps the scent simply pulls them forward, and the fall comes as a surprise, hidden by stone until it is too late. And yet that explanation does not fully account for dogs that survived, recovered, and then returned to the same bridge and leapt again. Others have suggested the local magnetic fields, the acoustics of the gorge, or something in the quality of the air at that elevation. The gorge itself has a strange acoustic quality, sounds from below rise up in ways that feel close and sourceless. Standing at the bridge's edge, the murmur of the stream seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In quieter moments, the place has a stillness that feels almost held, like the landscape itself is waiting for something. The bridge was built in 1895 by the Calhoun family, who owned the Overtoun estate for generations. It was meant simply as a private crossing, a graceful way to move between the house and the wooded grounds beyond. For most of its existence it sat in ordinary quiet, used by the family and their guests, unnoticed by the wider world. Then slowly, over the middle decades of the 20th century, the stories began to accumulate among the local people of Dumbarton. A dog here, a dog there, each story small on its own, but in time the pattern became impossible to overlook. The spot on the parapet where the leaps occur is always the same, a section perhaps 3 to 4 meters long, no more. Beyond that section, on either side, nothing unusual happens. Dogs walk calmly, unbothered, as they would on any other bridge. Only in that one short stretch does something shift, quietly, invisibly, in whatever way the world shifts for an animal's senses. Nobody has ever fully explained it, and the bridge continues to stand in its quiet gorge, patient and unchanged. The stream below keeps moving, the bracken keeps growing, and the wind in the beech trees above says nothing at all. From the still open water, the mine drifts landward now, settling slowly onto snow-covered slope somewhere far to the east. In the Ural Mountains of Russia, there is a high cold pass that sits quietly between two rounded peaks. The pass is called Dyatlov Pass now, named after a young man who led a group of students into those hills in the winter of 1959. Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old, a student of engineering, and an experienced hiker who loved the mountains deeply. He gathered 8 friends together, all of them young, all of them students at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in the city of Sverdlovsk. They loaded heavy packs with warm clothing, food, camping gear, and skis, and set off toward the northern Urals in January. Their goal was a mountain the local Monsey people called Klerksdorp, which means, in their language, the Dead Mountain. The group moved steadily through deep snow for many days, their breath rising in the cold air above the white, silent landscape. On the night of the 1st of February, they made camp on an open slope near the summit of Klerksdorp. They pitched a large canvas tent there, anchoring it against the cold wind that moved steadily across the bare hillside. That tent, and what was found inside it weeks later, is what makes this quiet mountain pass unforgettable. The group never returned from those slopes, and when rescuers finally reached the tent in February, they found something that made no easy sense. The tent had been cut open from the inside, long deliberate slashes through the canvas, made by someone who was already inside when they cut. The cuts were made with a knife, and the direction of the cuts showed clearly that whoever made them was pushing outward, cutting to get out fast. Whatever had frightened them was so immediate that they chose to cut through the tent rather than crawl to the door. They ran out into the night wearing almost nothing, some without shoes, some without coats, into temperatures far below freezing. Inside the tent, rescuers found boots, coats, food still laid out, cameras, diaries, everything left behind as though the group simply vanished mid-evening. The footprints of the group led away from the tent downhill in a calm, almost orderly line toward the forest below. They had moved together at first, not running, just walking steadily away from the tent into the cold darkness of the slope. Some of the bodies were found near a cedar tree at the forest's edge, where the group had tried to build a small fire. The branches of that cedar had been broken high up, as though someone had climbed it to look out over the slope above, perhaps to watch for something. Other members of the group were found farther from the tent, in different directions, alone or in small pairs. 3 of those found later had injuries that puzzled the doctors who examined them: broken ribs, a fractured skull, damage that seemed too severe for a fall on snow. One woman was missing her tongue, though the cold and the conditions made it difficult to know quite what had happened in that dark ravine. The Soviet investigators who traveled to Dyatlov Pass wrote in their final report that the group died because of an overwhelming natural force. They gave no further explanation, and the case was quietly closed, the files sealed away in Soviet archives for decades. When the files were finally opened years later, researchers and curious people came from all over the world to read what was inside. Some believed an avalanche had startled them in the night, though the angle of the slope seemed too gentle, and the snow too undisturbed around the tent. Others suggested military testing, or infrasound from the wind moving over the mountain in a certain way, creating sensations of panic. But none of the explanations ever quite settled over the evidence the way a good answer should, leaving the pass in its quiet, unresolved state. Today a small memorial stands near the pass, simple and quiet, and the mountain still sits above the treeline exactly as it always has. The tent is long gone, of course, but the slope remains, open and white and very still in winter, as it was that February night. The wind moves through that pass in a low, slow sound, the way it has for a very long time, knowing nothing of the questions left behind. And the pass waits there quietly, high and cold and patient, holding whatever it knows beneath all that soft, still snow. The hour has drifted a little later now, and somewhere out on the open Atlantic, a pale mist begins to settle over the water. It is December of 1872, and a brigantine called the Mary Celeste is somewhere in those quiet waters between the Azores and the coast of Portugal. She is a well-built two-masted sailing ship, about 30 meters long, solid and reliable by the standards of her day. Her cargo hold carried over 1,000 barrels of commercial alcohol, bound for ports in Genoa, Italy. On board were the captain, Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and 7 experienced crew members. Captain Briggs was known as a careful, steady man, not one to take unnecessary risks with his vessel or the people in his care. They set out from New York in late November, and for a time the voyage was ordinary and uneventful, as many voyages are. The Atlantic in November can be restless, but there is also a particular stillness that comes after a storm has passed. Then, on the 4th of December, another ship called the Dei Grazia came slowly within sight of the Mary Celeste. The crew of the Dei Grazia noticed something unusual almost immediately. The Mary Celeste was sailing erratically, drifting without clear direction. When they drew alongside and called out, there was no answer, only the slow creak of the rigging in the wind. A small boarding party rowed across the water and climbed carefully up onto the deck of the Mary Celeste. What they found was a ship that appeared, in almost every way, to be perfectly normal, yet completely empty of every living soul. The sails were partially set, the ship was still moving through the water, and the cargo below was largely undisturbed. In the galley, the remains of a meal were found, food that had been prepared and then simply left, as though someone stepped away for just a moment. A cup of tea sat on the table, still in its place, unfinished, as though the morning had paused mid-breath. In the captain's cabin, charts and navigation instruments were laid out in an orderly way, nothing overturned, nothing scattered. Captain Briggs had been keeping a ship's log, and the last entry was dated November 25, 9 days before the Mary Celeste was found. The entry recorded nothing alarming, just a routine notation of position, weather, and the ordinary progress of the voyage. And yet, sometime after that final entry, every person on board had vanished from the ship without a trace. The ship's one lifeboat was missing, a small detail that suggests, perhaps, a deliberate decision to leave, rather than a sudden disappearance. But no lifeboat or wreckage was ever found, and the sea, as it so often does, kept that secret entirely to itself. In the cargo hold, investigators found that 9 of the alcohol barrels were empty, but the ship showed no sign of fire or explosion. The ship's pump had been used, suggesting some water had entered the hold, though not nearly enough to threaten a vessel of her size. There were personal belongings still in the cabins, clothing, boots, pipes, small valuables, none of it taken in any apparent hurry. Little Sophia's toys were still in the captain's cabin, arranged as though a child had simply gone to sleep for the night. Investigators in Gibraltar examined the ship carefully for weeks, looking for any sign of violence or struggle, and found none. Many theories have been offered over the years: waterspouts, seaquakes, fumes from the cargo, even piracy, and none have satisfied everyone. The ship herself sailed on for years after, passing through several owners, as though nothing unusual had ever happened aboard her. She was eventually wrecked off the coast of Haiti in 1885, her final owner deliberately running her aground in what seemed to be an insurance scheme. But by then, the mystery of what happened to her 10 passengers and crew had already become one of the sea's most enduring unanswered questions. Somewhere between New York and the Azores, on a quiet stretch of open water, 10 people simply ceased to be, and left a perfectly ordinary ship behind. The Mary Celeste drifted on the water for 9 days before anyone found her, sails still catching the wind, going nowhere in particular. And the Atlantic, wide and slow and indifferent, simply carried her along, holding whatever secret it keeps about that December morning in 1872. Far away from wherever your mind has just been resting, somewhere deep in the American Northwest, a quieter story slowly begins to settle. It begins, as so many quiet mysteries do, not with a great discovery, but with a small one, a bundle of weathered paper found half buried along a riverbank. The year was 1980, and a young boy digging near the Columbia River in Washington state pulled 3 small packets of aged bills from the earth. The bills were in poor condition, discolored, partially decomposed, bound together in bundles of $20 notes, but their serial numbers were still legible. Federal agents matched those serial numbers almost immediately, because those exact numbers had been on a list kept for nearly a decade. They were part of the ransom paid to a man known only as D.B. Cooper, who had vanished from a hijacked airliner somewhere over the Pacific Northwest in November of 1971. On a rainy Wednesday afternoon, a man in a dark suit and tie boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305 in Portland, Oregon, carrying only a briefcase. He ordered a bourbon and soda, waited for the plane to reach cruising altitude, and then passed a flight attendant a small handwritten note. The note informed the crew that he had a bomb in his briefcase, and that he wanted $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills. The plane landed in Seattle, where the ransom was gathered, the passengers were allowed to leave, and the bills were handed over in a single bag. The plane took off again with only the crew, 2 pilots, 2 flight attendants, and the man who called himself Dan Cooper still seated near the rear. Somewhere between Seattle and Reno, over the dark and forested wilderness of southern Washington, he lowered the rear staircase of the Boeing 727 and stepped out into the night sky. No one saw him leave the aircraft, and no one ever saw him again on the ground. The FBI launched one of the longest and most extensive investigations in American history, mapping every inch of the likely jump zone in the wilderness below. Search parties combed the forests of Clark County, Washington, cold, wet, old-growth territory where the trees grow close and the undergrowth is thick and tangled. They found no parachute, no footprints, no bag, no body, only the quiet forest, unbothered and unchanged. Years passed, and the case remained open. The serial numbers of those $20 bills circulated quietly among bank tellers and curious citizens alike. People checked their wallets and their change, hoping to find one of the 404 bills that had never been recovered. And then, in February of 1980, a small boy named Brian Ingram found the 3 bundles near Tena Bar, a sandy beach along the Columbia River. The bills were deteriorated but intact enough to read, roughly $290 in total, still loosely bundled in their original rubber-banded stacks. The FBI confirmed that the serial numbers matched the ransom list precisely. These were without any doubt the bills handed to D.B. Cooper aboard that plane. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered, because the location made very little sense given what experts believed about the jump. If Cooper had landed where most calculations suggested, somewhere in the forests northeast of the river, those bills should not have drifted this far south. Some believed the bills had traveled downstream over the years, carried by flood waters or buried and slowly shifted by the movement of the river. Others believed the bills had been buried there intentionally, or had arrived by means that no investigation ever fully traced. What complicated things further was that the bills appeared to have degraded in place. The rubber bands decayed in a way consistent with years of slow burial, not movement. The money seemed to have rested in that sandy bank for a long, quiet time, and yet no parachute, no bag, no trace of a body was ever found nearby. Investigators returned to the area again and again in the following years, sifting the sands and probing the riverbed, finding nothing more. The rest of the $200,000, 394 bills, has never appeared anywhere in the world, not in any bank, not in any wallet. No one has ever confirmed whether D.B. Cooper survived the jump, a nighttime parachute into cold, wet, heavily forested terrain without survival gear. And yet the case has never been officially closed, because no death has ever been confirmed, no accomplice has ever come forward, and no confession has ever been verified. The bills found along the Columbia remain the only physical evidence ever recovered, 3 small bundles from a story that the river has not yet fully told. Somewhere out beyond the river and the trees, the rest of that money rests in a stillness that has outlasted every search and every theory. And gently, without urgency, the forests of Washington keep their quiet, and the river moves slowly on toward the sea. Somewhere far from here, the air grows warmer and stiller, settling over a quiet Iowa town like a soft woolen blanket on a summer night. The town of Villisca sits in the gently rolling farmland of southwest Iowa, a place of grain elevators and church steeples and long unhurried afternoons. It is a town where neighbors still wave from porches, where the sound of a screen door carries 2 houses down on a windless June evening. On a street called Lincoln, there stands a modest 2-story house, white clapboard, with a plain yard and a coal house leaning gently to one side. The house was built in 1868, and for decades it was simply the Moore family home, filled with the ordinary sounds of a family going about their days. On the night of June 10, 1912, the Moore family returned home late from a church social, the children still warm from singing and laughter. Josiah and Sarah Moore, along with their 4 children and 2 young guests, settled quietly into bed as the Iowa summer night closed around them. When morning came and the house remained silent past the usual hour, a neighbor grew curious and knocked, then tried the door, and then stepped inside. What had happened inside that quiet white house on Lincoln Street would never, in all the years that followed, be fully understood or explained. All 8 people who had gone to sleep inside were found gone, and an axe that belonged to Josiah Moore was discovered resting near the stairway. The mirrors inside had been covered with clothing, and the windows had been draped with the family's own curtains, pulled closed against the summer light. Investigators noted that the coal house outside held a piece of a keychain link, and that a cigarette had been carefully smoked and set aside. Whoever had been inside had waited, perhaps for a long time, calm and unhurried while the family slept through the warm Iowa night. The town of Villisca, population barely 1,000, had never known anything like this, and the news spread through the county in the span of a single morning. Hundreds of people came to see the house in the days that followed, walking through the rooms before any real investigation could be properly organized. The investigation that followed stretched across years and decades, touching dozens of suspects whose names were raised and then quietly set aside. A traveling minister named Lynn George Kelly was tried twice and acquitted, and the questions that surrounded him drifted unanswered into history. Other names were suggested over the years, quietly, by researchers and family descendants and local historians who never stopped looking. The house itself changed hands many times, sitting empty for long stretches, its rooms gathering dust and the particular silence of a place nobody quite knew what to do with. In time, the house was restored to something close to its 1912 appearance, its furniture and wallpaper and iron beds carefully returned to how they once were. The dresser still stands in the main bedroom, a plain wooden piece with a mirror that catches the light from the window on quiet afternoons. The children's room, small and low-ceilinged, holds 2 narrow beds and a washstand, ordinary objects made still by the weight of what once happened here. Outside, the elm trees along Lincoln Street have grown very tall since 1912, their canopy shading the sidewalk in long green pools of light. The Moore family is buried in a cemetery just outside of town, their headstones plain and upright in the Iowa grass, facing west. Their names are still legible, the letters worn soft by more than 100 Iowa winters and summers cycling slowly over the stone. The farmland around Villisca stretches away in every direction, flat and green in summer, quiet under an enormous sky that seems to press down gently. At certain hours the light on that land is very particular, a long golden wash that makes everything look both near and far away at once. People still come to stand on the porch of the house on Lincoln Street, looking up at its plain white face and feeling something they find difficult to name. The porch boards creak in a particular way, not loudly, just a soft settling sound as the afternoon air shifts over the yard. Inside, the parlor holds the kind of stillness that accumulates in rooms where time has moved slowly and nothing has been rearranged in a very long while. The kitchen at the back of the house still has its old iron stove, standing where it has always stood, catching the light from the east window in the mornings. What is known, and what is not known, rests together in that house, inseparable now, settled into the walls and the floors and the long quiet of the years. The Iowa night comes on slowly here, the last of the daylight pulling back from the fields and the rooftops and the white clapboard walls of Lincoln Street. And the house on Lincoln Street stands as it has for more than a century, unhurried, patient, holding whatever it holds beneath the wide and softening stars. Many centuries drift past before we arrive at a quiet corner of eastern England, where pine trees stand close together in the cold Suffolk air. The forest is called Rendlesham, and it stretches broad and still across the land near the North Sea coast. In the winter of 1980, United States Air Force personnel were stationed at twin bases nearby, Bentwaters and Woodbridge, surrounded by that same quiet forest. On the night after Christmas, lights were seen moving slowly among the trees, strange and silent and low to the ground. Several airmen walked out into the darkness of the forest to see what was there, moving carefully between the tall silent pines. What they found in a small clearing became one of the most carefully documented and quietly puzzling events in the modern record. In the clearing, on the soft sandy floor of the forest, there were 3 indentations pressed into the earth, forming a triangle. Each mark was roughly circular, a few centimeters deep, pressed into the earth as if something heavy had rested there briefly. The marks were measured carefully in the days that followed, their positions recorded precisely on paper. The branches of nearby trees were also found to be broken at a certain height, as if bent or brushed from below. And on the bark of the trees nearest the clearing, small scrape marks were found, faint but consistent, at a height of about 3 meters. A senior officer, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, returned to the site the following night with a small group, carrying recording equipment. He recorded his observations on a small audio cassette as he walked, and that recording has survived to this day. On the tape, his voice is calm and methodical, describing what the equipment was reading as the group moved slowly through the trees. A Geiger counter carried that night registered small but measurable increases in radiation near the 3 landing marks in the soil. The readings were highest directly at the marks themselves, and faded gently as the group moved further from the center of the clearing. Nobody has offered an explanation that satisfies everyone who has looked carefully at that data. The forest itself is ordinary in almost every way, a managed pine plantation, flat and quiet, with sandy paths winding between the rows. Visitors still walk there today, following the same paths through the same trees, and the clearing is not hard to find. There is a small trail marker now, near where the clearing lies, placed there quietly without ceremony. If you stand in that clearing and look up through the canopy, the sky appears as a small pale shape above the circle of trees. The silence in a pine forest is different from other silences, dense and soft, as though the trees absorbed the world around them. Lieutenant Colonel Halt wrote a formal memo to the British Ministry of Defence 2 weeks after the events, describing what had been found. That memo was declassified and released years later, and its language is careful, precise, and without exaggeration. It describes the depression marks, the broken branches, the radiation readings, and lights observed moving above the trees. The lights, he wrote, moved in complete silence and appeared to change color as they drifted between the trees. The men who were there have spoken about it many times across many years, and their accounts remain steady and consistent. No consensus has ever settled on what left those 3 marks in the earth, or what the men recorded on their instruments that night. Some have suggested explanations involving a nearby lighthouse, or an astronomical event, or an unusual weather pattern. Others have studied the radiation data and the memo and found those explanations less complete than they first appear. The forest does not offer answers, it simply stands, quiet and unchanged, the pines growing slowly taller with each passing year. The clearing where those marks were pressed into the earth is peaceful now, surrounded by the soft sound of wind through pine needles. Whatever came to rest there, briefly, in the cold winter ground of Suffolk, left its shape and then was gone. And the forest holds that quietly, the way forests always have, keeping their long stillness through the turning of seasons and years. Somewhere far from where we were, a soft golden light falls across a quiet stretch of open ground, warm and unhurried in the late morning. This is Adelaide, South Australia, in the summer of 1966, a city of wide streets and slow afternoons by the sea. Glenelg Beach lay at the edge of that city, a gentle curve of pale sand where families would gather on warm January days. The water there was shallow and warm, and children would wade out into it without a care, the horizon low and blue. On the 26th of January, 3 children came to that beach with their mother, and they played together in the morning sun. Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont were 9, 7, and 4 years old, and the beach was a place they knew and loved. Their mother rested nearby as children often do at beaches, and the morning passed gently the way summer mornings do. At some point in the quiet of that day, the 3 children were simply gone, as softly and completely as a cloud passing. Their mother searched, and then others searched, and the city searched, and the years passed, and no one ever found them. What remains today is the place itself, still there by the sea, the same stretch of sand under the same pale blue sky. Near the beach, not far from where the children played, there was a playground, a small and ordinary place of swings and shade. That playground was where witnesses last saw the children that day, standing quietly in the bright morning air. A woman who lived nearby saw Jane, the eldest, buying pasties from a shop, and she remembered the child seemed calm and at ease. Another person recalled seeing the 3 children walking together in the sun, heading somewhere with the easy confidence of children who know where they are going. And then the sighting stopped, and the trail grew still, and the beach went on shining as it always had. The playground where they were last seen became, in time, a place that people thought of quietly when they passed. It was an ordinary playground, the kind with a low fence and a patch of grass and the sound of wind through iron chains. In the months that followed, investigators spoke with hundreds of people, quietly and carefully, hoping for a detail that would open the story. One man came forward years later and said he believed he knew something, but his account only deepened the quiet uncertainty. Excavations were carried out at a property in suburban Adelaide, where investigators hoped the earth might finally offer an answer. The ground gave nothing back, and the silence settled again, the way it always does in this story. The beach at Glenelg still receives people each summer, and the water still comes and goes along the pale sand. The playground no longer stands as it once did, but the ground remembers in the way that quiet places do. People leave flowers sometimes, small and unhurried gestures, set down without ceremony by those who simply wanted to remember. The case has never been closed, and perhaps that is fitting, because the children were real, and the morning was real, and the beach was real. There is something in the way the light falls here in summer that makes the absence feel very close, and very old. The sea does not explain anything, and the sky does not explain anything, and the sand holds no trace that can be read. In the long summers since 1966, the beach has gone on being what it always was, bright and open and quietly itself. The playground, wherever its pieces have scattered, was once a place of real laughter and real running and real warm summer air. That is the thing that remains, above all else, the simple fact of 3 children on an ordinary summer morning in the sun. The question of what happened has drifted through decades like a slow current, moving without resolution, without end. And somewhere in the warmth of that January day, the story pauses, as it always does, in the brightness and the quiet. The sea goes on turning, slowly, the way it has always turned, unhurried and without answer. And the light, that same warm Australian light, rests on the sand as if nothing were missing, as if everything were simply still. Somewhere far from the last story, a pale winter light settles slowly over a small Pennsylvania town, soft and still as a held breath. The year is 1965, and the hills around Kecksburg are quiet, blanketed in the gentle gray of a December afternoon. Small houses sit along winding roads, smoke rising slowly from chimneys, the air cold and clean and perfectly ordinary. Then, just before evening, something appears in the sky above the town that no one expected and no one could quite explain. Witnesses across several states described a bright object moving steadily overhead, trailing a long shimmer of light through the cold air. It moved without the roaring urgency of a crashing aircraft, more like something gliding, unhurried, following the curve of the hills. And then, somewhere in the woods east of Kecksburg, it came down into the trees with a low, muffled sound that settled back into silence. Neighbors who had watched the light from their yards walked quietly toward the tree line, drawn more by wonder than by fear. The woods were still, the kind of stillness that holds its breath, with only the faint creak of frozen branches overhead. And nestled in a small depression in the earth, half buried among the roots and snow, there was something that had not been there before. It was shaped unlike anything with a familiar name, something between an acorn and a bell, broader at the base and tapering gently upward. The surface was a dull bronze color, smooth in places, with markings near the base that looked almost like a band of symbols carved into the metal. Those markings have never been fully translated, and no language catalog has claimed them with certainty, and they remain simply there, quietly unread. Within perhaps an hour, the roads leading into those woods were closed, and uniformed figures moved quietly between the trees with equipment and covered vehicles. Local fire crews who had responded first were turned back at the perimeter, told simply that the situation was under control. By morning, when a few residents returned to look, the depression in the earth was still there but the object was gone. Gone as quietly as it had arrived, leaving only the faint impression in the cold ground where something heavy had rested. In the days that followed, official statements described the object as a meteorite, or perhaps a misdirected satellite component, a natural explanation. But those who had stood closest to it that evening said quietly that it looked nothing like any meteorite they had ever seen described. Meteorites do not have smooth walls, they said, and meteorites do not carry bands of symbols near their base, and meteorites do not get quickly taken away. One local resident described it as warm to the touch, not the scorched cold of something that had fallen through atmosphere, but warm in a steadier way. The acorn shape itself became the detail that most people return to in memory, because nothing about that particular form suggests a natural falling body. The proportions were described as precise, not the irregular mass of a rock torn from space, but something that seemed to have been designed to a specific form. Decades would pass, and the witnesses who had stood at that tree line in 1965 would continue to describe the same details, without embellishment, without revision. Their accounts matched each other not perfectly, as true memory never does, but in the shape of the thing and the strange calm it carried. Researchers who later examined the site noted the depression in the earth suggested something of considerable weight had rested there for a short time. The surrounding trees showed no signs of violent impact, no shattered trunks, no fire-scorched bark, as if whatever landed had done so with great care. That absence of destruction became its own quiet puzzle, sitting beside all the other quiet puzzles that gathered around Kecksburg over the years. Freedom of Information requests filed years later retrieved some documents but returned others with pages removed, with only blank spaces where certain details had been. Those blank spaces are themselves a kind of evidence, or at least a kind of question, sitting silently in the record like the impression in the ground. The NASA connections that emerged in later investigations were never fully explained, threads that led somewhere and then quietly stopped. What can be said with certainty is only what was seen, and what was seen was something that settled into a hillside in Pennsylvania and was then taken away. And the hillside has been quiet ever since, the snow coming and going each winter, the trees growing slowly, the earth holding whatever memory it holds. Far above, the same winter sky that watched over Kecksburg that evening continues its slow turning, unhurried, holding more than it ever tells. Far across the ocean from where we just were, somewhere deep in the stillness of space above a quiet Ohio field, something arrived one summer evening in 1977. The Big Ear radio telescope sat in a meadow near Delaware, Ohio, listening patiently to the sky the way one listens to a distant sea. It had been listening for years, turning slowly, quietly cataloging the ordinary hiss and whisper of the universe drifting past. On the evening of August the 15th, a narrow ribbon of signal arrived from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius, clean and strong. The telescope did not alert anyone that night, it simply recorded, as it always did, a long column of numbers on a pale roll of computer printout paper. No one read the paper that night, or the next morning. The telescope kept listening while the printout curled quietly at its edge. Several days later, a volunteer astronomer named Jerry Emmons sat down with a red pen to review the printed columns, row by row. He moved slowly down the page, and then his eye caught a sequence of characters unlike anything around it, 6EQUJ5. Those 6 characters described a signal that had risen sharply, peaked, and faded, exactly as a genuine extraterrestrial radio source would appear as Earth rotated beneath the sky. In the margin of the printout, Jerry Emmons wrote the word "wow" with an exclamation mark, and circled it in the same red ink. That small, quiet notation on a piece of paper became one of the most famous handwritten marks in the history of science. The signal had lasted precisely 72 seconds, which was exactly how long the Big Ear would expect to hear any fixed point in the sky before rotation carried it away. 72 seconds of something arriving from deep space, and then nothing. The telescope listened and the sky gave back only its usual background hum. The frequency of the signal was very close to 1420 MHz, which is the natural emission frequency of neutral hydrogen, the most common element in the universe. For decades, astronomers had quietly agreed that if any civilization across the stars ever wished to be heard, they might choose this frequency, a kind of universal common language. The wow signal, as everyone now gently calls it, arrived on precisely that channel, as if someone had thought carefully about how to be found. Astronomers returned their telescopes to the same patch of sky again and again in the months and years that followed, listening with great patience. They listened through summer and through winter, through quiet nights and noisy nights, but the signal never came again. The original printout paper was preserved, the red ink still visible, still sitting quietly in an archive somewhere in Ohio. Scientists have proposed many gentle explanations over the years: a comet, a satellite, interference from a passing source. Each explanation, examined carefully, left a small remainder that the numbers would not quite accept, a loose thread in an otherwise tidy account. And so the printout remains what it has always been, a 72-second visit from somewhere in the direction of Sagittarius that no one has been able to fully explain. The Big Ear telescope itself is gone now, demolished in 1998 to make way for a golf course, leaving only a small plaque where it once stood. The meadow is quiet now, and golfers walk the same ground where the telescope once stood and turned its face toward the stars. Somewhere far above that field, in the direction of Sagittarius, the source of the signal has never been identified or found. The printout itself is not a dramatic thing to look at, it is just a page of numbers, pale and slightly aged, with a small red circle in the margin. Yet astronomers keep copies of it, and the image of that page travels quietly through textbooks and lectures and late-night conversations. There is something quietly remarkable about the fact that the signal chose a frequency any listening civilization would know to watch, and then came only once. Whether it was a natural phenomenon or something else entirely, the 72 seconds passed and the sky returned to silence, as if nothing had interrupted it. The search continued gently, with new instruments in new places, each one turning its face upward and listening in the old patient way. None of them have heard it again, and the frequency around 1420 MHz remains as quiet as it was on the morning after August the 15th. The original paper, with its red ink annotation, holds within it a question that 72 seconds were somehow enough to ask but not enough to answer. And somewhere, perhaps, in the long stillness between stars, the source of that signal still drifts on, unhurried, in no particular need of being found. The printout rests in its archive, the red circle holding its quiet question lightly, the way a page holds a word long after the voice that spoke it has gone. A soft mountain wind moves through the high valleys of Austria, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and cold stone. Somewhere in those quiet highlands, not far from ancient trade routes worn smooth by centuries of careful footsteps, a singular object was found. It was a skull, carved from opal, sitting as still and patient as the mountains themselves. Opal is not a stone that carvers often choose, it is delicate, fracture-prone, and stubbornly resistant to the blade. And yet here it was, shaped with extraordinary patience into the unmistakable form of a human skull, every hollow and curve rendered with quiet care. Those who first held it noted how it seemed to shift color with each small movement, cycling gently from pale cream to deep emerald to a kind of warm amber. Nobody had a ready explanation for why it existed, or who had made it, or how long it had rested quietly in the earth before it was found. Austria has been inhabited for a very long time. Celtic people settled these highlands, and before them, others whose names we no longer know. The skull passed quietly through various hands before reaching the attention of those who study such things, each owner perhaps holding it a little longer than they intended. Gemologists who examined it confirmed that the opal was genuine, a precious and unusual variety, not glass, not imitation. What was harder to confirm was the age of the carving itself. Opal does not yield its secrets easily to the usual methods of dating. The surface showed no obvious tool marks of modern machinery, no grinding lines that would suggest recent manufacture. And yet the precision of the carving, the evenness of the skull's proportions, left some researchers quietly uncertain about what tools could have achieved it in earlier centuries. Opal of this quality, this size, is itself rare, and Austria has been a source of precious opal since Roman times. The Romans prized Austrian opal highly, trading it westward across their vast empire, and some pieces found their way into objects of ceremony and reverence. It is possible, gently, quietly possible, that someone in that long Roman era shaped the opal into this skull with meaning now completely lost to us. In many ancient traditions, the skull was not a symbol of death but of memory, of the quiet persistence of those who had lived before. To hold a skull carved in such a luminous stone might have been to hold, in some sense, the light of a life that had passed. There is something in the way opal holds light that makes it feel less like stone and more like something caught mid-transformation. The skull was eventually catalogued and placed among collections that hold such uncertain things, objects with no clear provenance, no obvious origin story. It rests somewhere in that quiet company, neither explained nor dismissed, simply present in the way that genuinely puzzling things tend to remain. Outside, the Austrian seasons move slowly over the landscape, summer meadows giving way to the first pale frosts of autumn. The mountains that watched over the skull's long resting place in the earth still stand in their unhurried way, indifferent to our questions. There are places in the world where the ground holds objects longer than any living memory can reach, and Austria's highlands are among them. What is known, softly and without dispute, is that someone once cared enough to spend extraordinary time shaping a fragile stone into something meaningful. The care required to carve opal without cracking it demands a kind of slow, meditative attention that feels almost like devotion. Perhaps the person who made it worked in silence, over many months, returning each day to coax another small curve from the difficult stone. Or perhaps it was made quickly, in a single concentrated effort, by hands that already knew the stone from long experience. We do not know, and in that not knowing, the skull remains as quietly mysterious as the opal itself, full of interior light, full of unspoken history. Snow will come again to the Austrian highlands, softly and without announcement, settling on the same ridges it has always known. The question of who carved the skull, and why, and when, drifts quietly in the cold mountain air, unanswered, untroubled. It is enough, perhaps, to simply know that it exists, this small luminous thing, this patient keeper of a secret no one can quite remember. And somewhere in a quiet room, it continues to hold its colors, shifting slowly, as opal always does, with the changing of the light. The highlands breathe slowly tonight, and the old stone valleys hold their silence, as they have held it for longer than any name can say. The hour has grown a little later now, the night settling deeper into stillness, and somewhere far inland, beneath the red earth of South Africa, a quiet story begins. In the ancient rock formations near the town of Ottestal, in South Africa's northwest province, miners have been pulling something strange from the ground for many decades. Deep within the pyrophyllite, a soft gray mineral that crumbles easily in the hand, these objects appear as if they have always been there, perfectly preserved. They are spheres, or very nearly spheres, small enough to rest in a cupped palm, reddish-brown and dense, their surfaces worn smooth by time beyond reckoning. What makes them remarkable, what has made people quietly return to look at them again and again, is the grooves that encircle each one. Most carry 1, 2, or 3 parallel lines running neatly around their middles, as though carved by a careful and unhurried hand. The rock that holds them is said to be nearly 3 billion years old, formed long before animals walked the earth, long before even the simplest shelled creatures left their marks in ancient mud. And yet the spheres sit within that rock as though placed there, as though they were always meant to be found one quiet morning by someone reaching into the earth. Miners in the Ottestal area grew quietly accustomed to finding them, setting them aside on windowsills or shelves, the way one keeps an object that feels somehow important. Word spread slowly, the way word does in small towns, and eventually the spheres found their way into the hands of people who studied rocks for a living. Geologists examined them carefully, turning them in the light, measuring the grooves, weighing the dense metallic cores in their hands. The leading explanation, offered by those who study how minerals form, is that the spheres are natural concretions, mineral masses that slowly gathered around a central point over vast stretches of time. And yet the grooves remain quietly difficult to explain, their parallel precision sitting uneasily alongside the randomness one might expect from pure natural process. Some of the spheres are composed of a bluish metallite, dense and heavy for their size, while others are hollow and filled with a white spongy material. They are not all identical, not quite, and that variety is part of what makes them so quietly fascinating to hold and turn slowly in the light. One sphere, kept at the Klerksdorp Museum, was once reported to rotate on its own axis without being touched, a claim passed between visitors in low careful voices. Scientists who looked into it suggested that tiny air movements in the room were enough to set such a finely balanced sphere gently moving, given the right conditions. Still, the image lingers, something about a grooved stone sphere turning slowly by itself in a quiet room, the curtains barely moving. The spheres have drawn the attention of those who look at ancient objects and wonder whether the standard accounts of early life on Earth leave certain things unexplained. The thought is not offered urgently, only placed gently on the table, the way a question is placed when there is no hurry for an answer. Most researchers remain comfortable with the natural explanation, and there is good reason for that comfort. Minerals forming in strange and orderly ways is a phenomenon well documented across the Earth. There are iron concretions in Utah shaped like perfect spheres, blueberries of hematite scattered across ancient mudstone, no hands involved, only time and pressure and chemistry. And yet the Klerksdorp spheres carry something those formations do not, those particular lines, that quiet symmetry running around each one like a thought left unfinished. The Earth in that part of South Africa is old in a way that is almost impossible to hold in the mind, older than most of the familiar fossils, older than the first worms. When miners cut into the pyrophyllite and find a sphere resting there unchanged, they are reaching back to a time the planet has almost entirely swallowed. The spheres do not announce themselves when they emerge, they come out quietly, dusty, no different at first from any other lump of mineral except for the weight in the hand. Then someone brushes them clean and the groove appears, and for a moment there is a kind of stillness that has nothing to do with having an answer. They rest now in small museum drawers and on collectors' shelves, cool and solid and patient, indifferent to the questions that continue to drift around them. Outside the Klerksdorp Museum, the South African sun moves slowly across the sky, and the land around Ottosdal stays dry and wide and unhurried. Somewhere beneath that ground, more spheres wait in the pyrophyllite, exactly as they have waited for an amount of time the mind can only approximate and then release. There is something restful in that thought, something calm about objects that have been exactly where they are through all the noise the world above has made. The grooves neither ask nor answer, they simply are, as they have always been, encircling each small sphere in a quiet line that goes all the way around. And so the spheres of Klerksdorp remain, neither solved nor dismissed, held gently in the open space between what the Earth has explained and what it has kept quietly to itself. The night drifts on, the Earth turns slowly, and somewhere in the red soil of South Africa, something old and grooved and perfectly round continues to rest in the dark beneath. Slowly, the mind lifts upward, drifting over quiet forests and fields, before settling gently down into the cold Bavarian countryside of early spring. Somewhere in that rolling landscape, far from any town, a farmhouse called Hinterkaifeck sat alone beneath a pale sky. The year was 1922, and the farm belonged to the Gruber family, who had worked that land quietly for many years. It was a modest place, with low wooden beams and the smell of hay and cold earth that clung to every room. In those days neighbors lived far apart, and weeks could pass without anyone passing the Gruber's gate. It was in late March that someone in the nearby village began to notice that the mail was piling up uncollected. The bread delivery had also gone unanswered for several days, the loaves left resting at the farmhouse door. A neighbor finally walked the long path to Hinterkaifeck and found the farm quiet in a way that farms should never quite be. The livestock in the barn were still alive, and a thin curl of smoke had recently risen from the chimney. Yet inside the house, the Gruber family, 6 people in all, had been gone from the world for perhaps 4 days. What the investigators found in the barn that day would remain unexplained for the next 100 years and beyond. Among the tools and farm implements hung a mattock, a heavy agricultural axe used to break frozen ground. It was a simple, heavy thing, the kind of tool that generations of farm families had kept close against the cold hard earth. The axe itself had last rested somewhere near the barn entrance, in a place so ordinary no one had thought to note it. And yet it was that axe, that quiet farm tool, that had touched every corner of this mystery. What investigators could never quite settle was where the axe had come from, and where it had gone, in those silent days between. One quiet detail that stayed with everyone who studied the case was this: someone had been living in the house after the family had gone. The livestock had been fed, the fire had been tended, and food from the kitchen had been eaten over those missing days. Someone had stayed there, calmly, as though the farmhouse were simply empty and waiting to be used. The neighbors who first walked inside later described a strange stillness, as if the house itself were holding its breath. There were ordinary things in every corner: boots near the door, a coat on a hook, a bowl left on the table. And in the barn, beneath the hay, the investigators found where the family had been laid to rest, one beside the other. They had been found with a care that felt almost deliberate, arranged quietly as though sleep had simply taken them. The axe was never found after those days, and no name was ever attached to the person who had used it. Over the years, investigators would return to the case again and again, drawn by its quietness as much as its mystery. More than 100 suspects were examined across the decades, and each one, in time, was set aside. The farmhouse itself was demolished not long after, leaving only the land and the slow recovery of the fields around it. Today that ground is quiet, and the path that once led to Hinterkaifeck has long since grown over with grass and wildflowers. The name of the place, though, has stayed in the memory of those who study the quiet edges of history. There is something about an unanswered question, held gently over 100 years, that takes on a kind of stillness of its own. The axe, the empty house, the tended fire, each detail rests now in that stillness, unheld and unresolved. And somewhere under the open sky of Bavaria, the season that began that cold March morning is still, in some quiet way, continuing. The clouds drift slowly overhead, and the fields below hold their silence, as they have for a long, long time. And if you listen very quietly now, there is almost nothing to hear, only the faint breath of wind across open land. Somewhere in the hills of West Virginia, there is a quiet piece of land where a family once lived, and where something happened that no one has ever fully explained. The Sodder family had built their home in Fayetteville, a modest house on a gentle slope, surrounded by the kind of ordinary life that most people live and quietly forget. George and Jenny Sodder had 10 children, and that house was full of the small sounds and small warmth that a large family carries through the years. On Christmas Eve of 1945, most of the family went to sleep in that house, and the night was cold and still the way December nights settle over the hills. In the early hours before dawn, a fire began somewhere in the house, and it moved very quickly through the wooden walls and the dry cold air. George and Jenny and 4 of their children escaped into the cold yard and turned to watch the house burn, and they waited for the others to come out. 5 of their children did not come out, and by morning the fire had gone cold, and the ground where the house had stood was mostly ash and silence. What remained of the house was not much, only a low foundation of stone, a chimney still standing in the pale winter light, and the cold earth beneath. Investigators came and looked at what the fire had left, and what they found, or did not find, was something they could not easily explain. In most house fires from that era, investigators would expect to find some remains, bone fragments, some trace left behind by the heat. But the ashes at the Sodder house held very little, and for 5 children, searchers found almost nothing at all in the ruins. The chimney stood alone in the cleared space for years afterward, a quiet landmark that the family could see from the road when they passed. Jenny Sodder never moved far from that place, and she spent much of the rest of her life asking questions that the ruin could not answer. She and George erected a large billboard near the road with photographs of the 5 children, and for decades it stood there in the quiet air. The ruin itself became a kind of place of waiting, a patch of land where questions lingered longer than any answer that ever came. Over the years the land changed slowly, as land does, grass growing back over the ash and the stone settling quietly into the ground. The chimney eventually came down too, and after that the site was nearly indistinguishable from the hillside around it. What remained was something less visible than ruins, a kind of quiet persistence of the question itself, held in the air above that particular piece of ground. There had been strange things reported in the weeks before the fire, small things that seemed unimportant at the time, though they were remembered clearly afterward. A man had come to the house asking to do some work, and when George refused him, the man had said something that stayed with Jenny for years. On the night of the fire, the family telephone line was found to have been cut, and the ladder from the barn was missing from where it had been left. George tried to climb to the second-floor windows to reach the children inside, but the tires of his trucks had gone flat, and the engines would not start. These details came out slowly over the days and weeks that followed, each one a small thing on its own, each one adding a little weight to what could not be explained. The fire had burned fast and hot, and investigators noted that the structure was gone in a surprisingly short time for a house of that size. Months later, someone digging in the yard turned up what appeared to be a human vertebra, and for a brief time it seemed an answer was near. But a forensic examination concluded the bone had not been exposed to the kind of heat that would have come from the fire, and so the questions began again. Letters came to the family over the years from strangers who said they had seen children matching the descriptions in distant places, in cities far from West Virginia. One photograph arrived decades later, sent anonymously, showing a young man whose features Jenny studied carefully and quietly for a very long time. She believed what she believed, and no official investigation ever fully contradicted her, and none ever confirmed what she felt in the long years of waiting. The ruin was never a dramatic place, just a cleared hillside in a small town, and the ordinary quiet of it was perhaps the strangest thing of all. The land where the house stood sits today much as it has for decades, unremarkable to anyone who does not know what once happened there. Time has a way of covering things gently, the way grass returns to a burned field, slowly and without announcement, season after season. And yet the ruin remains a ruin in the quiet sense, a place where something ended and something else never quite resolved, still holding its stillness. There is nothing left to see there now, only the slope of the land and the sky above it, and a quietness that has had a long time to settle in. The hour has drifted a little later now, and somewhere in the quiet city the night has grown very still. In the pale January morning of 1947, a woman walking through a vacant lot in Los Angeles noticed something in the dry winter grass. What she found there would remain, quietly, one of the most studied and most unanswered cases in American history. The young woman at the center of it all was Elizabeth Short, who had come to Los Angeles the way many did, following something unnamed toward a warm and distant place. She was 22 years old, with dark hair and pale skin, and people who knew her remembered her as quiet and a little dreaming. The city around her in those years was all glittering ambition and salt air, a place where everyone seemed to be arriving from somewhere else. She moved through boarding houses and small rooms, and her days had the quality of someone waiting for something they could not quite name. And then one morning she was gone, and for 6 days no one who knew her could say where. When she was found in that vacant lot on South Norton Avenue, the scene had a stillness to it that investigators would later struggle to describe. The crime scene photographs taken that morning are among the most examined images in the history of American forensic investigation. Investigators and photographers arrived, and they documented the scene with the careful, methodical attention that was new to criminal investigation at the time. The photographs themselves have a gray, overcast quality, the winter light of that Los Angeles morning thin and without warmth. What made them unusual was not simply what they showed, but what they could not explain, even to those who spent years examining them. The case was given a name by the newspapers, the Black Dahlia, though Elizabeth Short herself had never used it and perhaps never knew it. The name came from a film playing at the time, a dark flower pressed into the public imagination before anyone had thought to question it. Police assigned to the investigation worked through hundreds of interviews, and the files they assembled grew very thick over many years. More than 500 people eventually came forward to confess to the crime, which told investigators something about how deeply the case had settled into the city. None of those confessions held, and no one was ever charged, and the case remained open in a way that felt almost geological in its depth. The photographs from that morning were studied by forensic experts across many decades, each generation of investigators finding something the previous had not noticed. There were details in those images, small and quiet ones, that pointed in directions no one could fully follow to an end. The vacant lot on South Norton Avenue was surrounded by quiet residential streets, houses with small gardens and the ordinary rhythms of a neighborhood. That such a thing could have happened there, in a place so ordinary, gave the photographs an additional quality that was difficult to place. Investigators at the time had no way of knowing that the case would still be read about and studied 3/4 of a century later. There is something in the photographs that resists resolution, a quality of incompleteness that seems almost built into the images themselves. Los Angeles in 1947 was a city still inventing itself, its streets partly suburban and partly something else, reaching toward an identity it had not yet settled into. The newspapers carried the story for weeks, and the images circulated through the city in ways that shaped how people thought about both safety and shadow. Elizabeth Short had grown up in Medford, Massachusetts, a town of quiet streets and cold winters, far from California in almost every way. She had come west for reasons that were common to many young people of her generation, a kind of reaching toward light and warmth and possibility. The case files include letters, photographs, and reports that have been preserved with a care that suggests how seriously it has always been taken. And still the photographs from that January morning remain the center of it all, gray and quiet and asking a question no one has answered. There is a particular quality to an unanswered question that has been carried for a long time, a kind of weight that becomes, slowly, familiar. Investigators who worked the case through the years often described a feeling that they were very close to something, and then not close at all. The lot on South Norton Avenue was eventually built over, and houses stand there now, ordinary and quiet beneath the wide California sky. And somewhere in the long record of that case, in a file or a photograph or a faded report, perhaps the answer rests, patient and unread, waiting. A soft wind moves through the Carolina coast, carrying the smell of pine resin and damp earth across a quiet, forgotten shore. Somewhere in that stillness, deep inside a grove of trees on Roanoke Island, a single word was carved into the bark of a post. The word was Croton, cut cleanly into the wood, as if left with great care by someone who wanted it to be found. It was the only message the settlers of the first English colony in America left behind, before they vanished entirely. The year was 1590, and a ship called the Hopewell had finally returned to the island after 3 long years away. Governor John White stood at the prow as the island emerged from the morning haze, hoping to see the faces of those he had left. He had sailed back to England for supplies in 1587, leaving behind 117 men, women, and children. Among them was his own daughter, Eleanor, and his granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. Wars in England delayed his return again and again, and the 3 years stretched into a silence he could not cross. When the Hopewell finally anchored off Roanoke, the shore was quiet in a way that felt different from simple distance. The settlement had been there, the faint outline of it still pressed into the earth, but the buildings were gone. Grass had grown over where the houses stood, and the trees had begun to lean back into the space that people once occupied. White walked the perimeter of the old fort slowly, and it was there on the post that he found the carving. He had asked the colonists, before he left, to carve a cross if they departed in distress, but there was no cross. Just the one word, calm and deliberate, placed at eye level where it would be seen immediately upon arrival. Croton was the name of an island south of Roanoke, home to a people who had always been on peaceful terms with the English. White understood the word as a direction, a sign that the colony had moved there, and felt something loosen in his chest. He prepared to sail south to Croton that same evening, but a storm rose and pushed the Hopewell far out to sea. The anchors were lost, supplies were low, and the captain turned the ship east toward the Caribbean rather than south. White never returned to Roanoke again, and no record exists of what he felt about that particular fact. For centuries afterward, the carved tree stood as the only physical trace that anyone had ever spoken to the people of that colony. Archaeological work at the site has found objects, iron tools, a signet ring, buried quietly in the soil. They suggest people lived here, worked here, and then one day simply stopped. Some researchers have found traces of European material culture far inland, suggesting the colonists may have walked into the continent. Others have found pottery and copper objects among the descendants of the Lumbee people that seem to carry English influence. The clues are gentle and inconclusive, spread across the land like seeds that never grew into a clear answer. The carved tree itself no longer stands, the post it was cut into rotted away over the quiet centuries. But the word it carried has not disappeared, it remains in the historical record, as patient as the island itself. Croton still sits in the English language, in the mouths of historians, in old ships' logs, in the margins of maps. Roanoke Island today is quiet, forested, shaped by wind off the Sound, much as it must have been in that long-ago autumn. The Sound that surrounds it is shallow and pewter-colored in the late afternoon, ruffled only by a passing wind. If you were to stand at the edge of the old fort site now, you would hear mostly pine needles and the distant cry of a heron. The island holds what it knows very lightly, the way a forest holds a name carved long ago in wood that has since returned to earth. And so the colony rests somewhere between history and wondering, unhurried, open, like the slow tide moving through the Sound. Step back nearly a century, and find yourself on a quiet beach in South Australia, where the sea moves slowly and the morning air carries the faint smell of salt. It was the 1st of December, 1948, and a man was found lying on Somerton Beach, his body perfectly still, as if simply resting in the cool sand. He was dressed neatly, his clothes pressed, his shoes polished, and his hands lay quietly at his sides as the tide moved in and out nearby. No one who passed that morning knew who he was, and no one has ever truly known since. He carried no wallet, no identification, no letters, no name stitched into any of his garments, only a few small objects that raised more questions than they answered. A comb, a packet of chewing gum, a half-used box of matches, and an unused second-class train ticket, each one ordinary, and each one strangely silent. Investigators searched carefully, and eventually they found something tucked deep inside a hidden fob pocket of his trousers, a small, tightly rolled piece of paper. On it, printed in a delicate typeface, were two words, Tamam Shud, Persian for, it is ended, or, it is finished. The phrase had been torn from the final page of a very rare copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a book of ancient Persian poetry, gentle and philosophical in tone. The Rubaiyat is a book of quiet meditations on time and mortality, written in quatrains that float between acceptance and wonder, like leaves drifting on still water. Months passed before that particular copy was found, left in the back seat of an unlocked car parked near the beach on the same December night. The copy was unusual. It was an edition so rare that only a handful were thought to have ever been printed, and finding it felt like the mystery deepening rather than easing. Inside the back cover of that found book, faint pencil marks appeared when investigators held it to the light, 5 lines of seemingly random letters. The letters formed no known language and matched no cipher that cryptographers of the time could break, despite long and careful efforts. Codebreakers, linguists, and military intelligence analysts examined those 5 lines for years and quietly set them aside, unresolved. Also found inside that same back cover was a telephone number, written in pencil, which led investigators to a young woman living not far from the beach. She asked that her identity not be made public, and her name was kept from the press for decades, she herself carrying a quiet, guarded secret to the end of her own long life. She acknowledged she had owned a copy of the Rubaiyat and had given it away, but to whom, and why, she never fully explained. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam has a gentle philosophy at its heart, that life is brief, that beauty passes, and that one should rest quietly in the present moment. It is a book that has long been given as a gift between people who shared something unspoken, a feeling, an understanding, a farewell. The man on the beach had no history that anyone could trace, no fingerprints on file in any country, no dental records that matched, no missing person report that fit. His suit was well made, but its labels had been carefully removed, every single one, from every single garment he wore. This detail, so deliberate, so careful, was not the work of accident, but of someone who wished to leave nothing behind by which they could be named. In the quiet years that followed, researchers and families and curious strangers returned to the question of who he might have been, and each time, the answer remained just out of reach. The torn page itself, that small slip of paper with its 2 Persian words, became the most haunting detail, carried so carefully, so close to the body. Tamam should, it is finished, a phrase from a poem about acceptance, about the turning of time, about the quiet end of things. The beach at Somerton is calm and wide and faces westward, so the evening light falls long and golden across the sand each day as it did then. Somewhere in those unanswered years, someone somewhere must have noticed his absence, a chair left empty, a door that stopped opening. But whoever they were, they never came forward, and the world slowly grew used to not knowing, the way the sea grows used to an empty shore. The torn page, the cipher, the rare book, the polished shoes, each one a quiet object that knew something and kept its silence. There is something unhurried about mysteries that hold their shape across decades. They do not press for answers, they simply remain. The words of Omar Khayyam move slowly through his verses, asking only that the reader sit a while, breathe, and let the hours pass without urgency. And perhaps that is the most restful thing about this quiet unsolved story, that it asks nothing of you, only that you drift alongside it for a little while. Somewhere on a quiet beach, the sea continues its slow conversation with the shore, unhurried, patient, carrying its old questions lightly on the water. Somewhere in the quiet desert, there is only the soft sound of wind moving across dry stone, and nothing else. In the high desert of California, in a place where the land is pale and still, a peculiar object was once found resting inside a lump of rock. The rock had been collected from the dry Owens Valley, a broad basin nestled between 2 long mountain ranges. When the outer casing was split open, there inside was something that no one expected to see at all. Nestled within the hardened casing was a small ceramic cylinder, with a metallic core running through its center. Around it wound a copper coil, faint and green with age, preserved somehow within the stone. The object was the Koso artifact, and when people first looked at it closely, they could not quite agree on what it was. Some who examined it said it looked very much like a spark plug, the kind used in gasoline engines. But the question that lingered, slow and patient, was how a spark plug could have come to rest inside what seemed to be ancient hardened rock. The rock around it was a kind called a nodule, formed slowly over time when minerals harden layer by quiet layer. Such formations can grow around almost any object, patiently and without haste, the way the desert itself moves through time. The Koso artifact was found in 1961, near the town of Alancha, by people who had been collecting geodes along the dry lake bed. They had brought the stone home to crack open in search of crystals, and found instead this curious metal thing. Word moved slowly out from that quiet desert town, and eventually reached people curious about strange and unexplained things. Some looked at the artifact and thought of ancient civilizations, of lost technologies buried and forgotten beneath the earth. They imagined hands, very long ago, fashioning something not unlike an engine part, in a time before any engines were known. The idea settled gently into the imagination, like dust settling after a desert wind has passed through and gone. Later, other people looked at the object very carefully under magnification, tracing each small detail with patience. They found that the ceramic insulator, the copper coil, and the metal thread all matched a champion spark plug from the early 20th century. The match was quiet and specific, down to the particular shape of the threading and the way the ceramic was formed. And yet the stone around it, the hardened casing, remained a question that did not dissolve so easily into explanation. Concretions can form around objects in decades, not always millennia, when the right minerals are present in the soil. The dry Owens Valley lakebed, where the artifact rested, is rich in just those kinds of minerals, patient and slow-working. So a spark plug, dropped or lost in the early 1900s, might slowly become encased in stone within a human lifetime. And yet there is something about the Koso artifact that stays with you, unhurried, the way a half-remembered dream does. Perhaps it is the image of those collectors, cracking open an ordinary stone, expecting crystals and finding metal instead. The desert keeps many things quietly, beneath its pale and untroubled surface, without announcing them at all. The Owens Valley stretches long and quiet between its mountains, and what lies beneath its cracked dry floor is never fully known. The artifact itself no longer exists for anyone to examine, lost sometime after it passed through various hands across the years. Only photographs remain, and the memory of those who held it, and the slow ongoing question of what exactly the stone remembers. The desert does not explain itself, and the Owens Valley still lies open beneath its wide and cloudless sky. Somewhere out there, more nodules rest in the dry soil, holding whatever they hold, in no hurry to be found. The wind moves across the valley again, low and soft, as it has moved for a very long and unhurried time. And the question rests there too, still and patient, like everything else the desert decides to keep.